Okay. So welcome everybody. So we're looking there, as I said, I was following particularly on from some of the insights of David Hume. One of the reasons I like the way in which he worked, because he was actually analyzing the way things work in terms of history. He wasn't expecting human beings to conform to some sort of ideal that he had for them, which is often the approach that idealists have, like Plato. They have a certain vision, and this is the way it should be, and everybody has to conform themselves to that ideal. And the Bible's not like that. The Bible's not an idealistic book. It has a very realistic understanding of human nature, and it comes up with the basic structures and laws that fit ordinary human beings. And David Hume then, as I was talking about last time, he was basically doing the same thing. He was also studying history of England in particular, and also he was reflecting upon that. This is the way human beings are. So what is the best kind of society in that case? How do things work? And said Adam Smith did the same thing. Okay, so we looked at that, justification from property. Now I want to look a little bit at the spiritual dimension, which David Hume doesn't pay any attention to whatsoever. He himself was an agnostic, if not an atheist, certainly a very skeptical person. But even though he's a skeptic, at the same time, he recognized people are religious. And at the same time, he could see the effect that religion had upon people, and in particular, their behavior. And so he recognized actually religion is incredibly important within society, but he only understood it from a functional point of view because he wasn't a praying person. He wasn't interested in that sort of thing, but he could see the functional importance of religion. And so he recognized that. But anyway, I want to bring up a little bit more the spiritual dimension, looking at and trying to understand property, which is what we're looking at the moment. So in Genesis, it says, now the Lord God had planted a garden in the east in Eden, and there he put the man he had formed. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. Now, this is kind of interesting. It says there, the Lord God planted a garden. So what was God doing? God was a gardener. God did the gardening. God planted the tulips and he planted the trees and the rose bushes and everything else. And so God was doing the gardening. But then after that, he put man that he had formed and put him in the garden to work it and take care of it. So God wasn't telling human beings to do anything that he didn't do himself. He just wanted Adam and Eve to take over his job, being the gardeners, looking after the natural world, which he'd been doing up until then. That's kind of interesting. When we talk about human beings being the image and likeness of God, even at that kind of level, we're in the image and likeness of God with the same kind of role, following God and doing what God did to become like God. So we're to become like God. God did the gardening. We should do the gardening as well. So a bit further on, then as we saw in Genesis, God created the heavens and the earth. So because God is the creator of the heavens and the earth, God created the universe, that means God is the owner of the universe. God owns the universe. God owns everything. God owns the earth. God owns everything. And so when he put Adam there, Adam's role was like a steward, which is a very traditional Christian concept, or a caretaker. He put Adam there to look after the Garden of Eden, to look after the natural world. So if we think about it in terms of modern language, it's like God is the freeholder and we're the leaseholders. Yeah. God is the freeholder of the universe. God is the freeholder of all the earth, all the land. Yeah. So that means there's a limit on absolute ownership. You might think I own this field, but you only own it on lease from God. That means you have to look after it because it ultimately it belongs to God. We're just leaseholders. We're just people passing through. Yeah. God is here all the time, watching over everything. We're born, we live, and we die. We're just passing through. We're just the leaseholders for a certain amount of time. So this puts limits on the idea of absolute ownership. So when you own something, it doesn't mean you can destroy it in that sense, because it's not, we don't own the freehold of the land. We're only leaseholders. So we don't have you can't say this absolutely belongs to me, therefore if I want to, I can destroy it and pollute it and do anything I want. We don't have that authority because God is the owner. And then the principle talks about this in this way, in this kind of language. It says that God wanted Adam and Eve to grow up and become lords of creation. So ultimately, God is the Lord of creation, the Lord of hosts. He created it. But he wants us to become the Lord of creation in his place. Because naturally, the reality is God doesn't have a physical body. God can only interact with the natural world through human beings. God wants us to be his body, with the body of God. And through us, God is able to do the weeding. God is able to feel the soil, what it's like, pick the apples, eat the apples, enjoy the apples and eating fish and everything else. God wants us to be Lord of creation. So to be Lord of creation, again, it means to take care of it, look after it, be responsible for it. That's why God said to Adam and Eve, name all the creatures. So when you give something a name, it means you're also taking responsibility for it. You have a personal relationship with that object or that thing or that animal. If you know a person by name, you treat them as an individual, not just, something abstract in that sense. So along with this, the true Lord of creation, then Father also talked about becoming a true owner. Okay, so that means ownership. So that means, although we're leaseholders, actually we are the owner. Just like, if you own your house, then you're responsible to look after it. But at the same time, because it's your house, then it means you can redecorate it. It means you can put on an extension if you want to. It means you can sell it. It means you can repaint it, knock it down and put something else there in its place because it's yours. Yeah, you're the freeholder in legal terms, but not in spiritual terms, of course. You're the freeholder. So that means you can be the true owner. Now, if you're not the owner, you don't have the authority to do any of that. If you're a tenant, that means you're paying rent to the freeholder, the landlord. So it means if something goes wrong, you're not responsible for fixing it, the landlord is. If you want to redecorate, you can't think, I'm just going to redecorate my house and repaint it. You don't have the authority to do that. You have to ask the landlord's permission. You don't have the authority to knock the house down and rebuild it. It's not yours. You don't have the authority to put on an extension. Only the landlord has the authority to do that. So that's the difference between being an owner and a tenant. So if you're a tenant, you cannot be the Lord of creation. You cannot be a true owner. You cannot develop your creativity. And so part of the point of the third blessing then, of being a true owner and Lord of creation, is to be able to inherit God's creativity. Yeah? But you can only inherit God's creativity if you have the freedom to be creative, which means the freedom to experiment, means the freedom to repaint the house in the color that you would like it repainted in, yeah, and to be artistic or to do all these sorts of things without asking anybody's permission because it's your house. Yeah, so that's the difference. So that's a spiritual justification or explanation or spiritual dimension for property, and particularly for private property. Without possibility of private property, nobody can become a Lord of creation or a true owner or inherit God's creativity. Yeah. But there's also another dimension to property. That's a political dimension or social dimension. And this is somebody called Friedrich Hayek. He was a Nobel laureate in economics. He's also awarded the Founders Award by Father many years ago. I think in the late 80s or mid 80s. I think mid-late 80s. Anyway, he talked a lot about these sorts of things. And he said, what our generation has forgotten is that the system of private property is the most important guarantee of freedom. Yeah, the most important guarantee of freedom, not only for those who own property, but scarcely less for those who do not. It is only because the control of the means of production is the factory, the shop, the office, the business, only because the control of the means of production is divided among many people acting independently, that nobody has complete power over us, that we as individuals can decide what to do with ourselves. Yeah. So how does that work? Okay, that means if you own your own house, then you might annoy the local politician, but he can't do anything about it because it's your house. If you don't own the house and you annoy the landlord, he can kick you out. If the landlord is the state and you annoy the state and you annoy the bureaucrats who are working for the state, they can make your life miserable and you can end up homeless. But if you actually own your own house, it doesn't matter how much you annoy the local authority or the local government or local politician, it's your house, guaranteed, protected by law. Yeah. It also means, it says here also, the control of means production is divided among many people. So that means there's, you may have a particular skill as a carpenter. And if you fall out with the owner or the manager of a particular business, building business, then you can go and seek employment at another business. Or you can even start your own carpentry business. Yeah. You have the freedom to be able to do that because you can own the tools, you can own the workshop, you can do all these things. But if there's only a single owner and you can't own your own business, you can't own your own carpentry shop because it's all owned by the state, then if you annoy somebody, you can lose your job and you can never get employment ever again. So that's why private property said is the most important guarantee of freedom. Because without being able to own something, you start worrying about, oh, maybe I shouldn't say that. I might lose my job. Maybe I shouldn't do that. I might lose, I might lose my livelihood. Maybe I shouldn't say that. I might lose my home. Yeah, in which case you have no freedom. You don't have freedom of religion, freedom of speech, or freedom of anything, because you're always insecure. When you own something, when there's private property, you can own something, you have security. Yeah. And nobody can take away your business or your home because it's yours, you own it, it's yours and protected by law. So, as Hayek says, if we want to preserve a free society, it is essential we recognize that the desirability of a particular object is not sufficient justification for the use of coercion. So it's really important, just because somebody wants something, that doesn't give them the right to go and take it. Just because your neighbor wants your car, doesn't give them the right to go and take it. Just because your neighbor doesn't have as nice a car as yours, doesn't mean he has the right to go and take it. Just because your neighbor, or just because somebody doesn't have a place to live, it doesn't mean they have the right to take over your home and start squatting in it if you're living there. Yeah. Just because the state wants to reorganize society, it doesn't mean the state has the right to go and nationalize and take away your home, your house, your property, your land, your farm, your business. Yeah. So it doesn't matter what, that's a free society. And you might think, well, this is all terribly theoretical, but actually it's not. Private property and freedom, this is how it works. How it works. So this is something written by Leon Trotsky. He was a Bolshevik, and he fell out with Stalin. And because he fell out with Stalin, because there's a difference of opinion, he realized, I have a difference of opinion with Stalin. Stalin's going to kill me. So he fled. And he fled, I think, to somewhere in Latin America, Mexico, I think it was. Anyway, he left the country. But anyway, Stalin hated him and wouldn't forgive him. So Stalin sent somebody from what's called, I think, the NKVD in those days. And he was murdered. Anyway, so this is what Trotsky wrote in his memoir, The Revolution Betrayed, because he didn't like what Stalin had done to the Russian Revolution. He said, during the purges in the last month of 1935 and the first half of 1936, hundreds of thousands of members of the Bolshevik Party were again expelled. Among them, several tens of thousands of Trotskyists. These are people who are ideologically aligned with Trotsky. The most active were immediately arrested and thrown into prisons and concentration camps. As to the rest, Stalin, through Pravda, that's the newspaper which means truth, openly advised the local organs not to give them work. That's the point, not to give them work. In a country where the sole employer is the state, This means death by slow starvation. The old principle, who does not work shall not eat, has been replaced with a new one, who does not obey shall not eat. And that's the point. Because the state was the sole employer, then Stalin would give this kind of instruction. Not just Stalin, it went on all the time at all kinds of levels, but anyway. And then everybody, all the local authorities, the local government would think, oh, if we don't do what Stalin tells us to do, we're going to lose our jobs as well. And we're going to lose our livelihoods, and we're going to be out on the street. And so, of course, they all did it. And so anybody that supported Trotsky, anybody that's regarded as a dissident, they could not find work because there's only one employer. And then when they became homeless, they were regarded as being vagrants. It was against the law to be a vagrant. And so they were arrested and they were sent to do some work, useful labor. It's called forced labor, and given probably 15 or 25 years of forced labor. That's the importance of private property for freedom. Really important. And as Hayek says, a lot of people now, they think, oh, private property, it's all about selfishness. It's not about that at all. People say, oh, it's selfish to want to own your own house or own your own car, or own your own farm, or own your own business. They haven't, when people say that, they've got no understanding, A, about the motivation people have for wanting to own something, and B, got no understanding what actually motivates people who do own their own businesses. What makes people tick. Okay, so that's the first principle that David Hume laid out, stability of possession, that when you possess something, you own it, and nobody has the authority or the right to take it away from you because it's yours, you own it. However, David Hume noticed, it's not enough for people to have stability of possession. Since people have different goods, there has to be a way for people to be able to exchange their property. So supposing you have a garden, and in your garden you grow apples, okay? And your next door neighbor, he has a field, and in his field he has sheep. And you'd quite like to have a bit of lamb, and he'd quite like to have some apples. But how does that work? So you need to have a new kind of principle here. So he said the second principle, therefore, is a convention. And as I said, it's entirely just a convention. It's nothing to do with that rights over goods may be transferred by consent, and only by consent. So this means that trade and the consequent division of labor becomes possible, so that goods can be produced which are available to all. So this means, okay, these are my apples, but I can transfer ownership of my apples to you. And this is your sheep, but you can transfer ownership of your sheep to me. So it's no longer your sheep, it's now my sheep. These are no longer my apples, they're now your apples. That makes sense? So transfer of ownership is really important. So how does that happen? As he said, it has to be by consent. You have to agree to do that. So how does that practically happen? Maybe transfer by giving. You may want to give your next door neighbor some apples. So once you've given them your next door neighbor apples, they're no longer your apples. Once you've given them, you can't go and say, oh, can I have them back, please? They're still mine. You can't do that. You've given them. They now belong to that person. So you can give things away, and then those things belong to that person. You can't go and get it back again. Another way is by sharing. Another way is by transfer, by exchange or selling. So you can have barter. Okay, I've got a sack of apples here. I'll exchange this sack of apples for one of your lambs. Okay, let's do that exchange. Here's a sack of apples, and there's a lamb. Now the apples belong to you, and the lamb belongs to me. Or you can do it by selling. Okay, so I do exchange like barter by selling. Okay, I'll sell you my apples for, a sack of apples for 10 euros or pounds or dollars or wherever you happen to be living. That's another way of doing it. Just a more convenient way than barter. So this only works then, so it can transfer by consent, which means you can't have stealing. That's against the law. No stealing, no theft. Also means no fraud, no robbery. You can't, hold somebody up on a stagecoach and go and rob them of all their jewelry or whatever. That's not consent, that's robbery. So all these things are against the law because they taking away people's stability of possession. But as he says here, then specialization becomes possible. So you no longer do you have to think, okay, I've got to go and grow all my own apples and do all my own fishing and make all my own shoes and do all, milk my own cows. I have to do everything by myself. Okay, together with my wife and my children, we have to do everything all by ourselves. Once you have the possibility of the transfer by consent, there's a possibility, okay, I'm just going to specialize in growing apples, and my next door neighbor is going to specialize in going fishing, and another neighbor is going to specialize in looking after sheep, another neighbor is going to specialize in dairy farms, and then we can just exchange, yeah? And so I don't need to do everything all by myself. There's a possibility of specialization now because it becomes possible to grow far more apples than you can possibly need to eat yourself because you know somebody else is going to want to buy them or exchange them, yeah? And so then it leads to a huge increase in manufacturing, a huge increase in growing. So when people are farming, they're no longer thinking, I'm just farming for myself, but actually I'm farming so actually I can feed other people. I'm farming and growing all these things so other people can have apples and things to eat, but also it means that I'll be able to benefit by having goods that I can exchange or sell for lamb, fish, and everything else. And so you have a huge increase in wealth. That's where prosperity comes from. When people are doing more than just subsistence farming, just supporting themselves at a very low level, they're specializing, doing far more than they need to do. They're producing far more than they need for themselves, and everybody's producing far more than they need for themselves. That means the whole wealth of everyone's wealth increases. That's how countries, societies become more and more prosperous because of that. It's called trade. That's why trade leads to prosperity, an increase in wealth, and everybody benefits. It's a win-win. And how do you regulate this? Regulate it? It's by supply and demand. So you figure out, okay, living in this village of mine, there's 30 households. So it's not worth me growing enough apples to feed 1,000 people because they're going to go rotten. So it's only worth me growing enough apples to feed 30 households. That makes sense? Otherwise, okay, if I'm going to grow enough apples for 1,000 people, I need to go and take them into town. And so you have supply and demand, yeah? If the demand goes up, then people recognize, oh, a lot more people want tomatoes or apples than they did last year. I'm going to plant more trees. I'm going to increase the supply. As the demand increases, the supply increases. If the demand declines, then you either have to find new people to sell your apples to, or you just reduce the supply. You don't grow as many as you did before. You try growing other kinds of trees instead. So this supply and demand then means there's not as much waste as there would be otherwise. So that's why you have a market then. So you want to exchange goods by consent. Well, so you go and find a place where it's convenient to do that, where people who buy and sell meet. Where's that most likely to happen? It's most likely to happen where there's a lot of traffic, a lot of people going. Where's that? Well, there's these inconvenient things in the countryside. They're called rivers. It's really hard work crossing a river. So where do people cross rivers? They try and cross the river where the river is narrowest. And where the river is narrowest, that's where people build a bridge. So where there's a bridge, then everybody is funneled in to that spot to cross the river at that bridge, and then they go on their journey. And so you have a concentration of people passing through. So if you want to sell your goods, you go to a place where there are lots of potential customers, and that's usually by a river. So that's why markets develop there. That's why settlements develop there. That's why towns develop there, by rivers, and particularly by crossings, or by a port where there's a sea, another important place where settlements develop. Because again, you've got transport. When you've got transport, you come people, customers coming and going all the time. So the market then is just a convenient place to buy and sell. And the point is, they call it a free market because it means anybody is free to buy and sell. So it means there's not just one person allowed to go to the market and sell apples. Anybody can come from anywhere and set up their stall selling apples of different varieties. And everybody who's selling apples can set their own price. There's not a fixed price that everybody has to sell the apples at that price. Everybody selling apples can adjust the price depending upon whatever they want. They might think they got the best apples, in which case they might sell them for more than other people, or they might have too many apples, depending on, on the number of potential customers, in which case they might lower the price of the apples. And so anybody then can go and sell whatever they want. And if you want to go and buy, there may be one particular apple seller who you don't like for whatever reason. And it really doesn't matter what the reason is. You don't have to go and buy from him or her. You can go and buy from somebody else. So it means that the sellers, you can sell to anybody. Anybody can go and sell, and anybody can go and buy from whomever they want to. So there may be one particular person who sells apples, and he doesn't like you for whatever reason. And he thinks, I'm not going to sell apples to that person. I can't stand them. But that doesn't matter because they can just go and buy their apples from somebody else. Yeah, that's what it is. That's the benefit of a free market. Yeah, it creates huge amounts of freedom. And also it means that if you're a seller, you have to be polite. Because if you're going to be rude to your customers, they're all going to go somewhere else. Whereas if there's a monopoly supplier, then you can be as rude as you like to the customers because they've got nowhere else to go. And you can put the price up as high as you like because they got nowhere else to go. Whereas if you're there in the marketplace and you're selling things and the price is too high, people are going to go somewhere else to buy. Or if you're really rude, they're going to go somewhere else to buy. Or if half your apples are rotten, or you get a reputation for selling half-rotten apples, you're going to lose all your customers. So that's the great thing about a free market. People have the freedom to buy and sell and to make choices about who they sell to and who they buy from. And then, of course, money then develops as a convenient unit of exchange. It's inconvenient exchanging apples for sheep. You might have lots of apples, but you really don't want a sheep. And you actually want fish, but it so happened for whatever reason, nobody came to the market selling fish that day. So do you want to take all your apples home because there's nobody selling fish? It's also inconvenient to sell your apples and exchange them for a sheep because you don't really want a sheep, but at least you can walk home with a sheep and bring it back the next day. But so if there's a convenient unit of exchange, it's called money, then you can put the money in your pocket because it's light and you can take it home and it's not going to go off like tomatoes or apples or a sheep. And the most convenient money is gold because it doesn't go rusty. It's also rare, which means it's incredibly valuable, which means you don't need a lot of it. So it's a very dense form of value because there's not much of it. It doesn't go rusty. And so it's a very convenient unit of exchange, much more convenient than apples or pears or sheep or shells or whatever. And so that's why gold basically became the convenient unit of exchange. Everybody wanted to sell for gold or sometimes silver because they knew they could easily use that gold to buy something. Yeah, that's why. Whereas if they exchanged their apples for a sheep, they wondered, well, I don't know if I'm going to find somebody else who's going to want my sheep. But if you exchange your apples for gold, gold speaks for everybody wants gold. So you can buy anything with it. Yeah. So that's all it is. Money then is not the root of all evil. Money is a really convenient unit of exchange. That's all it is, a unit of exchange. To make commerce, trade much more convenient for everybody. And of course, you want to keep the value of the money. Yeah, you don't want inflation. You want value of the money to be maintained. So a little spiritual dimension. Okay, how does that fit with the principle? Exchange, well, that's give and receive, give and take. You exchanging goods means you're selling something. You have the buyer and the seller, subject-object relationship. They have a conversation. They may barter oh, I think your apples are too expensive. I'll offer you this amount. Well, if I buy twice as many apples, will you give it to me for a less price? And so you have give and take, you have an exchange, you have a conversation. When you get agreement upon a price, then you have that exchange. So it's based upon give and take, or give and receive. And of course, it's based also upon freedom and responsibility. You are free and able to respond. So when someone's selling something at a certain price, you can respond and say yes or no. Yeah, you have the ability to make choices and to respond. And it's the same. You have in a free market the ability to make choices. You can invest money in something, and you may have a good or a bad investment. And the point is, you suffer the consequences of your choices. You make good decisions, good investments, and then you profit from them. You do well, you prosper. You make some bad investments for whatever reason, and your business doesn't go well and it declines. So freedom and responsibility then is the basis of the free market. But that's also freedom within the law, which I'll talk about in a moment. So you're only free within the law. And one of the laws is, first of all, stability of possession, which means you cannot steal things. You're breaking the law. And exchange has to take place through consent. There may be somebody, who has something, and you want it, and they don't want to sell it. Okay, you can't take a gun to them and say, right, I'm going to buy it from you for this price, whether you like it or not. So I'm not stealing it from you, but I'm going to give you the money for it that it's worth. But even though you don't want to sell it, I'm going to make you sell it. Again, that's not exchange by consent. So again, that's illegal. That's against the law. So you're free within the law. So you can't steal, and you can't force people to buy or to sell if they don't want to. And then, so this is connected to the second blessing. It's about ethical relationships. Relationship between the buyers and the sellers should be ethical relationships based upon trust, based upon give and take. And it's connected in that sense to the third blessing. Is about relationships between buyers and sellers, between people. And so then it's still not quite there yet. So Hume realized, okay, we needed something more. Hume is basically just describing the way things work. Yeah, he's watching and saying, how do things work? And he discovers these three principles which underlie society and the market. And that's what he's describing here. Anyway, so he says, the third one he says is performance of promises. So he said it's very inconvenient to barter and have simultaneous direct exchange of goods. Yeah. One person's crops may be ripe in the spring, another's in the autumn. Okay, so you can't say, well, I'm going to go and swap my apples for your potatoes, because they, as far as I know, they become ripe at different times of the year. It's really awkward. So the third principle is required, performance of promises. If people make promises which are directed towards some future performance, they should keep them. Yeah. Otherwise, there can be no trust, no trade, no society. So you come along and you say to this person, look, I'm a potato grower. My potatoes, I'm going to harvest my potatoes in, I don't know, when do you harvest potatoes? In September, October or something? Thank you, Oliver. But you've got your apples, which you picked off the tree in July. I want to exchange a sack of potatoes for a sack of apples. But if I have to wait, the apples will be dead by then. So I promise you, if you give me a sack of apples in July, I promise you that in September, I'll give you a sack of potatoes. That's a promise. And that's how it works. There have to be these kind of promises. And then people trust and they believe. Yeah. So when you're doing that, okay, I'm giving you credit. I believe that when your potatoes are ripe, you're going to give me a sack of potatoes back. In other words, I'm giving you this sack of apples on credit. The word credit comes from the Latin word credo, I believe, which means I trust you. I believe that you will keep your word. Yeah. And that's the way it works. And so that's why I have this expression, My word is my bond. Okay, I promise I'll do it. I pick up the phone, I say, I want to order this number of things. Okay, I believe you'll do it. I trust you. And you find in the world of business, trust is really important. If you go along and you say to a businessman this, and then you go back on your word, they'll never do business with you ever again. Yeah, because they realize, I cannot trust you. I do not believe your word. So et cetera, et cetera. And that's, so business, the free market then is based upon trust. It's an incredibly moral place to be. If you want to do business and you don't keep your word, very soon you're going to go out of business because nobody will want to do business with you. That's just the way it works. So it's based upon trust. The free market, you trust people, including strangers. Yeah? When somebody comes into a shop, you assume that they're a good person. You assume they're not going to bring a gun out and rob you. You assume that the money they give you is real money. But it's a basic assumption. You trust strangers. Yeah, you're walking down the street and you see a stranger walking towards you. You're not afraid. You assume this is a decent, good person, just like yourself. And that's the free trade. It takes place between strangers. People who've never met each other before, other ends of the world. They just pick up the phone, they make an agreement because they hear this person is trustworthy. Yeah, that's why it's very important to have a good reputation. Yeah, so you pick up the phone, you say, I want to order something from you, and the person says, I don't know you. Can you give me a reference? Okay, these are my references. So that person says, okay, I'll just check, and they phone these other people up who they might know themselves and say, is he a reliable, trustworthy person? And the person says, yes, he's trustworthy. Then you do business. Yeah, so you have trust going on between strangers here. Yeah, in a very primitive society, you only trust the people you know personally. Within a family, okay, we all know each other. Within a village, everybody knows each other. But then you can't get beyond that. If you want to go to beyond that to social, national level, you have to have trust between strangers. People you've never met before, they walk into the office, walk into your shop or whatever, your factory, and you have a basic attitude of trust. Yeah, unless they do something which makes you question that trust that you would have in them. It's usually the way it works. So here, the great thing is, in the free market, it doesn't matter what one's race, sex, religion, or politics are. If somebody comes into your shop and they're a good, decent person, they want to buy something from you, you don't say, what's your religion? You don't say, what your politics? You don't say, what's your sex or your race? Do you want to buy something or not? Are you a good customer? Yeah. And the same when you go in to buy something in a shop, again, you don't care what that person's sex, race, religion, or politics are. Yeah. If you go around discriminating this kind of way, the only person you're damaging is yourself. If you refuse to sell things to people because you don't like their religion or race or whatever, the only person suffering is you. Yeah. If you don't want to buy things from somebody because of their race, religion, or sex or politics, you might find yourself suffering because you're having to go somewhere where things are more expensive. So you're the one that's suffering. Yeah. So generally speaking, the free market, it's just based upon trade. Nobody cares about all this stuff here. Okay, so this is a kind of a good thing, I think. And so if we just summarize here, then we'll have a break. Just how these things connect together. So you got the three principles of justice. So for Hume, these are the three principles of justice which create a just, fair, and good society. We connect these to the three blessings, which I did a little bit there, and the three laws, which Father talked about. So through this understanding here, society then is a society of owners, which means third blessing, dominion over the creation, being a true owner. Yeah, so we have to recognize people own things. Yeah, people own their own house, they own their own business, they own their own car, they own their own bicycle, they own their own apple trees. Everything belongs to somebody. Yeah, society is a society where everything belongs to someone, which means everyone is responsible to take care of something, those things. And so as a society of owners means the law is do not steal, And Father talked about not misusing public money, which is an extension of do not steal. That's the first law of society, don't steal. Then society is a market. Again, this is based upon the second blessing, which is about ethical relationships, how you treat people in an honest, open, transparent way, treating people in the right way. Yeah, not mugging them, not robbing them, all that sort of thing. Father talked about not having a moral sexual relationship. But again, so society is a market, society is a place where people will interact with each other and they buy and sell things and they do this and they do that. Yeah, nobody's planning this. No one's controlling it. People are free to make all their own decisions. No one's saying, oh, you have to do this, you have to do that. People have the freedom within the law, this framework of law, to make these decisions themselves. And the third, David Hume pointed out, society is moral. The first blessing is mind-body unity. Mind-body unity, in this sense, is there's no difference between what you say and what you do. That means you keep your promises. You say one thing and then you do the same thing. Promise keeping is really important. So again, Father talked about not hurting a person's heart. Well, extend that, no violence, no murder. And of course, if he lies to somebody and somebody feels lied to, they feel deceived and they feel hurt. So you can see here, this is really, I find this so interesting. You've got the religious dimension here in the Bible, the three great blessings, yeah, fruitful, become a moral person, fruitful, multiply, it's about ethical relationships, and have dominion over the creation, it's about being an owner. So you've got the three blessings, the religious dimension, the legal dimension. Father talked about the three fundamental laws, and he also got David Hume's idea of the three principles of justice. Explaining, as I said, you know, when I read these kind of philosophers and political philosophers, I'm always interested to know, you know, which ones have discovered the principle for themselves. And so when I came across David Hume, this is years ago, I thought, wow, this is amazing. This fits with the principle, the three blessings. And then it really helped me to understand, you know, that. And so sometimes we think of the three blessings only in a religious way. Oh, God gave Adam and Eve these three blessings. But you can also look at it, actually, this is the way the world works. And this is the important point. The principle is not idealistic. It's not an ideal to which human beings should conform. This is actually the way the world works. David Hume was an empiricist. He wasn't, you know, he was just describing, based upon his study of history, he was describing this is the way it works. If you want to have a civilized, peaceful, and good society, you need to have these three fundamental laws of justice. That creates a just society, a fair society, yeah, where people behave in a certain kind of way. That creates a peaceful, just, and fair society. It's entirely descriptive, but he had that kind of mind to be able to see these things, to analyze the historical process and discover it. This is just the way it works. So this, for me, is really important because I'm a scientist. Yeah. The point is, it may be a good theory, but does it work? Does it actually correspond to reality? So the reason why I said yesterday, I think it was, communism is not a good theory because it doesn't correspond to reality. Communists try to make reality correspond to their theory, but actually, a good scientist tries to understand what is reality and tries to make their theories explain and correspond to reality. Yeah, you know, though Marx said it's scientific atheism, actually it's unscientific because it's not empirical. Yeah, socialism is not empirical. It's about coming up with some kind of abstract ideal and trying to make society conform to that ideal, as opposed to David Hume. So this is the way human beings are. This is the way they behave. This is, you know, these are the basic principles for a good, decent, fair, just, and peaceful society. And so that's why I thought, oh, that's really interesting. Yeah. Okay. Oh, yeah. So that was the goal, to create a peaceful and just society. And you can't have one without the other. If there's a lot of injustice around, people go around stealing things, you get a lot of fighting, you get a lot of conflict, and you don't have peace. When everybody recognizes this is that person's field, this is my field, that's their house, this is their stretch of the river, etc. And everyone recognizes every single piece of land belongs to somebody and people respect that, then you don't have conflict and you have a peaceful society. And then you have a justice, and it's a just society, because it's unfair and unjust for people to go around stealing other people's, property and things like that. And then, as I said, you have this way of exchanging things, and you have a moral society. And that's generally speaking the way most things are like this most of the time. And it's based upon trust. And you don't have to go around carrying your papers. You don't have to carry around carrying your ID cards. Someone asks you what your name is. You tell it to them, and they believe you. In societies which have a very low level of trust, everyone carries an ID card. In a society David Hume describes, where there's a very high level of trust and people basically trust strangers, you don't need to prove your ID to anybody, because people just take you at face value. They believe that you are who you say you are. It's only in societies where people are dishonest that you have to start issuing ID cards. This is one of the huge problems in the UK, because it's basically a trust-based society. The people come here who don't operate in that way, it's so easy for them to just completely misuse the system, and then it ruins it for everybody. So that's what Hume talked about. So let's just have a look briefly at communism. How does that compare with what David Hume is describing? What is communism? Well, first of all, the essence of communism, Marx and Engels said, communism in a soundbite is the abolition of private property. So Marxists, communists, Proudhon, those kind of people, they said property is theft. Yeah. So if property is theft, the solution then is to abolish private property, and that's what communism is. So when you abolish private property, well, who owns it then? Who has control over it? Yeah. Well, the state ends up owning it. It's taken into what's called public ownership, which means it's owned by the state, and which means it's controlled by the state. So when we say it's controlled by the state, what are we saying? It's actually controlled by the people who are employed by the state. Who are the people employed by the state? Well, we call them in England, they're civil servants, or a less polite term is they're just bureaucrats. They're just controlling, administering everything. Yeah. So they're the ones with the power, because even though they don't own it personally, they're able to administer this state property in the way that they think it ought to be administered, and they're able to favor some people and discriminate against other people, and there's endless amounts of corruption go on. And so there's no free market. So if you don't have free market, then you have to have a planned economy, which I'll look at in a moment. And then you also have the state and party control over the creative arts. So this is the abolition of the third blessing, because it means you cannot become a true owner. If nobody can own their own house, nobody can become a true owner. Therefore, you cannot become the lord of creation, because you cannot own your own farm or your own business or anything. You cannot control it and make the decisions that affect your piece of land, because it's not your piece of land, your business that you set up, because it's not your business. You can't decide how your shop is going to be run, because it's not your shop, etc., etc. You can't become a lord of creation. And that means you can't inherit God's creativity. Yeah. So in communist societies, you're only allowed to get your art or your books published if you belong to a particular society of writers. You can only belong to the particular society of writers if you're willing to make sure that your art, your writing, conforms to a certain ideological model. If your writing doesn't conform to the expected ideological model, nowadays it's called political correctness, then you can't get your books published. Yeah, we can see this is going on in the world today. Yeah, some people can't get their books published anymore because they're infringing on political correctness. There's a big controversy just, I think, a couple of months ago. The Penguin wanted to publish Jordan Peterson's latest book, They could have made a load of money out of it. But all the people working on Penguin Books in America, they all complained. They started crying and weeping. They were getting offended by his political views. And it was a scandal that Penguin Books should be publishing Jordan Peterson's work. So they wanted to cancel Jordan Peterson, just like lots of people have been canceled. That's called communism. Political correctness, the woke, is just a new version of communism. You cannot express your creativity because the people who have control over certain things will not allow you to publish. And then the second one is communism is also the abolition of the second blessing. Communism too. I'm not going to talk about the family aspect of what communism does to the family, just in terms of social relations and economic relations. And so the reason why the adoption of a system of central planning necessarily produces a totalitarian system are fairly simple. So when you have socialism, which is the abolition of private property, ultimately, and the state control over everything, it inevitably, inherently, always produces a totalitarian system. Whoever controls the means, in other words, whoever controls what a factory is going to produce, or what the shop is going to sell, or what this or what that, whoever controls that must decide which ends they're to serve. So, you know, the bureaucrat in the factory, controlling the factory, he decides what that factory is going to produce. Or if he doesn't have the authority to do that, some bureaucrat in the capital of the country sends an instruction to the person who's managing that factory, this is what you have to produce. So whoever controls the means decides what ends they're to serve, what's going to be produced there. As under modern conditions, control of economic activity means control of the material means for practically all our ends. It means control over nearly all our activities. So if the state then can shut down the economy, then the state can control the whole of our lives. We can see this going on today. People's businesses being destroyed, livelihoods being destroyed through no fault of their own. It means control over nearly all our activities. So the state then, because it's able to own everything and control everything, it can decide, you know, what you're allowed to watch at the cinema. It can decide what kind of plays can be produced. It can decide what kind of books can be produced. It can decide what kind of style of clothing everyone's going to wear this year. You got Mao's suits that they all used to wear in the communist period. The state decides what kind of cars everyone's going to have, what kind of housing everybody's going to have. It means the state then can control everything. So nature's detailed scale of values, which must guide the planning, because when you make a plan, you have to decide, well, what values should guide the plan that we make. Makes it impossible that it should be determined by anything like a democratic means. So it's got nothing to do with what ordinary people want. There's some bureaucrat sitting in an office somewhere deciding, well, I think this is what everyone should be wearing this year. This is what I think all cars should be this particular color, or whatever it is. The director of the planned system would have to impose his scale of values. So whoever's running it decides. So in the Soviet time, when it was Stalin, then he decided everything. So there's a very famous Soviet composer, his name was Shostakovich, brilliant composer. Anyway, he wrote a symphony, and Stalin listened to the symphony. And from what I understand, Stalin picked up the phone to Shostakovich and told him there was something wrong with his symphony. There's certain parts of it needed to rewrite so that it was much more optimistic in its tone. That's it. How does that work? Is there any freedom of artistic expression there? So the person who's the director of the plan system imposes his scale of values upon everything. His hierarchy of ends. So he decides what's most important, what's of middle importance, what's of least importance. In other words, he imposes his values or his group or the group of values upon the whole of society. Nowadays, it's called political correctness. Certain group of people impose their values of what's right and wrong on everybody else, which if it is to be sufficient to determine the plan, must include an order of definite rank in which the status of each person is laid down. Yeah, so it becomes like a pyramid. If the plan is to succeed or the planner to appear successful, people must be made to believe the objectives chosen are the right ones. That's why you have propaganda. That's why I have a newspaper called Pravda, which means the truth. So the state then tells people, this is what you're supposed to believe about this. Yeah. And you have to believe it. Every criticism of the plan or ideology underlying it must be treated as sabotage. We're living in this kind of society today. You know, the government has a certain kind of plan about lockdown or whatever, and anybody who criticizes that gets slagged off and accused of sabotage. Yeah, because everyone has to believe in the policy. You know, if you don't believe in the policy, then the BBC gives you a really hard time. There can be no freedom of thought, no freedom of press, because anybody who criticizes the way things are sabotaging it. So we're not allowed to have people to criticize things. Where it is necessary, everything should be governed by a single system of thought. And that's why you don't have a free press. That's why you have the state controlling what is done, put out through the media. The state uses the media as organs for propaganda. In theory, socialism may wish to enhance freedom. So you talk to ordinary socialists, always talk about socialism leads to freedom. But in practice, every kind of collectivism consistently carried through, must produce the characteristic features which fascism, Nazism, and communism have in common. Yeah. Usually people think, oh, Nazism, fascism, they're right wing, communism, left wing, but actually they're all just forms of collectivism, where the state controls, owns, and directs the economy and society and the media and everything else. So totalitarianism is nothing but consistent collectivism, the ruthless execution of the principle that the whole comes before the individual and the direction of all members of society by a single will supposed to represent the whole. And we can see this kind of thing creeping into our society today. You can see it creeping into Britain, loss of freedom of speech. Teachers are no longer afraid that if they say the wrong thing, they might lose their job at school. And we've seen teachers losing their jobs. We've seen people who publish books unable to publish books. We've seen people at university losing their jobs, all kinds of things, as the state takes more and more control and imposes ideology upon people and subverting free institutions as well. So these free institutions realize if we don't, start conforming to what the state wants, that we're going to get shut down. And so losers, in Britain we have something called independent schools, but actually independent schools themselves are no longer independent in terms of what they teach, because they realize they're having to conform to the expectations of the state, which means conform to the expectations of the people working for the state in public service. And the people who work for the state in public service are almost exclusively members who are incredibly woke, very, very politically correct. And if you're not politically correct, you lose your job and your livelihood. And if you want to sign up, I was a school teacher and I read all the small print to sign a contract to become a school teacher. And you have to sign up to political correctness to get a job as a school teacher. You have to sign up to this politically correct woke ideology to get a job as a school teacher. So you have to decide, what am I going to do? Am I going to lose my job and not be able to get employed? Or I'm going to pretend that I believe in this? Very, very difficult moral choices people have to make. And if you don't teach that, then I have a friend who lost their job because they refused to do that. So communism then, that's the abolition of the second blessing, which David Hume is talking about, because it's no longer a free market. There's no longer the free exchange of things, because nobody can own anything. So nobody can freely go to a market and buy and sell whatever they want. And then communism is also the abolition of the first blessing. There's Vladimir Lenin. He said, atheism is a natural and inseparable part of Marxism, of the theory and practice of scientific socialism. As I said, it's not really scientific at all. It's just ideology. But it's so how can you worship God? Well, God doesn't exist. Okay, so Bukharin, who's the first ideologist of the Bolshevik Party, he said communism is incompatible with religious faith. And Solzhenitsyn said, in our country, the lie has become not just a moral category, but a pillar of the state. So the first blessing then is about mind-body unity. Mind-body unity is being honest, open, and transparent. It means there's no difference between what you say and what you do. You tell people what you believe, and in a free society, you have the freedom to believe what you want to believe, to worship God the way you want to worship God. Solzhenitsyn said, the lie has become not just a moral category, but a pillar of the state. In other words, if you want to get a job, you have to lie about what you believe. In a communist society, if you were Christian, you could not go to university. So you have to make a choice. What am I going to do? If you were a Christian and believed in God, you could not get a job as a school teacher. So what are you going to do? Are you going to tell the truth, or are you going to tell a lie and compromise your integrity? That's the point. That's the way it works. That's the way people are controlled. And so if you want to believe in God, then obviously you can't fulfill the first blessing because it's not possible. So that's why no freedom of speech or religion. And as I said, that's the way it's becoming in our country, in Britain today. It's the same way going like this. So people say, the West is going communist, it's going socialist, and people think, it's ridiculous. But actually it's true when you actually analyze it in terms of what's going on today in Europe and America, and I don't know about other countries in the world. This is the way it works. You have to tell lies if you're not politically correct. If you're politically correct, you actually believe in political correctness, it's like being a signed up member of the Communist Party, then you're okay. But if you don't, then you have to make a choice. And in communist countries, anyway, there's a lot of persecution, suppression of religion. The Bolsheviks came to power in 1917, there are 54,000 churches. A few decades later, 1941, there are only 500 that were still open. All the others were either destroyed or they were closed. And there was the imposition of a new identity. I'm not going to go into that. Okay, so what are these laws then that Hume is talking about? So what are laws? What's the purpose of law? How does law function? Well, it's a system of rules that mediates the relationships between people. So, okay, we have a law, you can't, murder is wrong. Okay, so that's a rule or a law that mediates a relationship between people. We may disagree, we may get into an argument, that's fine, but it's against the law to go and punch somebody, or because you don't like what they say, or any reason really, or to commit some act of violence against them, or to murder them. So these are laws, they mediate the relationship between people. They're limits to how you can behave in your relationship with somebody. Yeah, you can get into a discussion, you can get into an argument, that's fine. You can say all kinds of insulting things to this person, that's fine. It's rude, but you can't murder them. You cannot commit an act of violence against them, physical violence. So these are the kind of basic rules. So these then create certain kind of rights. Murder is wrong. We have a law against murder that creates this idea of the right to life. Also certain kind of obligations, yeah, like buying and selling and all these kind of obligations. Because of the law, that means there's a certain kind of obligation I have to another person. And so Aristotle said the rule of law is better than the rule of any individual. In other words, I'm not ruled by individuals. I'm not ruled by the king, the queen, or a bureaucrat. I'm just ruled by the law. So all I have to do is observe the law. And the law tells me the things that I'm not allowed to do. As long as I don't rape, murder, or rob, or various other laws, then I'm okay. I can do whatever I want to do, except break the law. So this then creates freedom. Freedom is an English word. Doesn't exist in any other language in the world. And I know people are going to get outraged who come from other countries, but I'll explain how it works. This is the definition of freedom by John Locke. Freedom is to have a standing rule to live by. Well, now first I'll explain what the word means. The word freedom is made up of two words. Free means you can do anything that you want to do. I'm free, I can do anything I want to, I can say whatever I want to say, I can go wherever I want to go, I'm free like a bird. Yeah. The other part here is dom. Now the suffix dom means law. So it's an old English word like called doom. Doomsday in English is Judgment Day. The Book of Dooms was the Book of Laws. So this word freedom is a combination of two words, free and law. It was created by an Anglo-Saxon called Alfred the Great. He was the only English king who was called the Great. Alfred the Great is an Anglo-Saxon, and he was translating the Bible, the Psalms, into English. And he found a word, an expression in one of the Psalms, and he couldn't find the word for it in English. So he's like a very good German. He thought, well, okay, I'll just join two existing words together to create a new word. So he created a new word, freedom, which means free and law together. And this is how it works. Freedom is to have a standing rule or law to live by, common to every one of that society. So the law, you cannot steal, you cannot rape, you cannot murder. That law or these laws apply in the same way to every single human being, every single person living in that society. Those are laws. And made by the legislative power, that's the parliament, erected in it, a liberty to follow my own will in all things. So liberty here is just another word for free. So I'm free to follow my own will in all things. In other words, I can do anything I want where the rule prescribes not. So I can do anything I want if it's not against the law, and not to be subject to the inconstant, uncertain, unknown, arbitrary will of another man. So that means being ruled by an individual. So anybody can tell me what to do, but I don't have to pay any attention to them whatsoever. Why should I obey them? As long as I'm not breaking the law. So somebody can come along, a policeman, and can tell me, or an uncertain, unknown, arbitrary will of another man. They can come along, they can tell me what to do, but I don't need to do it. And they can't force me to do it, because to force me to do it is against the law. That's the point. So this is English. This is the English understanding. So that word doesn't exist in any other country in the world. In German, you have Freiheit. Free is frei. Heit doesn't mean law. It's just an ending. And it's the same in any other country. In French, you have liberté. That just means free. Doesn't mean freedom. Yeah. So the cry for freedom isn't the cry to do anything you want. It means I want to be free to do anything I want within the law. As long as I don't break the law, I can do anything I want. I can write any kind of music I want. I can travel wherever I want to. I can do anything I want as long as I don't break the law. So the law doesn't tell me what I have to do. The law just tells me what I'm not allowed to do. That's the difference. In some countries, you can only do what the law says you can do. If it doesn't say in the law you can do that, you can't do it. Those are called regulations. Yeah. In a free country, you can do anything you want as long as you don't break the law. So this creates a possibility then to be creative. So to be creative means you can come up with a new idea and you can invent it, and you don't have to ask anybody's permission to invent something. You don't have to ask anybody's permission to create anything, because as long as you're not breaking the law and stealing somebody else's metal or whatever it is for your invention, you can invent anything you want. So this is basically why the Industrial Revolution and scientific revolutions took place in England, because anybody with a good idea could go along and experiment. They didn't have to get anybody's permission. They didn't have to go and ask the government or the bureaucrat, can I build a factory? If they owned the land, they could build a factory, and they could make anything they wanted, and they could sell it to anybody they wanted to. They could find anybody who wanted to buy it. And this led to that's the free market. That led to a huge outburst of creativity, industrialization, and a huge increase in wealth. And that's what Adam Smith noticed. So, so in that sense, it's a little bit nice, but the reality, as we know, is life isn't always like that. You know, life isn't always like that because there are lots of threats to this way of life. So the point is, well, what do you do with people who don't observe the law? We all know that people have fallen nature. There are people who sometimes are selfish and greedy. Yeah, they want something, and instead of buying it, they steal it. Yeah, there's some people who want something, and instead of filling in the form correctly, they cheat and they lie. Yeah. So what do you do with people who go around breaking the laws? How do you deal with this kind of problem? The problem of a fallen world. The other kind of problem which you find is the problem of getting invaded by neighboring tribes. You know, maybe your tribe may have worked out these laws and everyone's respecting other people's ownership and property. Everyone's following the rules and exchanging by consent. Everyone's keeping all their promises. But supposing there's a neighboring tribe or nation and they think, wow, these people are incredibly rich because of their economy is doing incredibly well because they're observing these laws, they're becoming an incredibly wealthy and rich nation. We want their gold. We want to go and invade them and steal everything. And so you get invasion by neighboring tribes or countries. You get robbery, rape, and murder is what usually goes along with that, the violation of third, second, and first blessings. So what do you do with a world where you have people like that? How do you deal with this problem? And so that's why these are the kind of challenges that the Israelites faced in Canaan. Those of you who were with me for the last workshop, Joshua to Jesus, we looked at the kind of problems that the Israelites faced under the period of the Judges. They were trying to do it based upon, they created the kind of society that David Hume talked about. There was no government. They just had these laws. They were God's laws. They're following their conscience. But sometimes there were people who didn't follow their conscience. There are sometimes people who did rob, who did murder, who did rape, who did steal. What do you do with that in that kind of situation? How do you deal with those kind of people? And so we saw there's one particular shocking example, only happened once, of this Levite whose concubine was raped and murdered, and the whole of all the other tribes are outraged. So they came to the tribe of Benjamin, to the town where this took place in Giva. And they said to the people of Giva and the tribe of Benjamin, you have to hand over those men who raped and murdered this man's concubine. But the people wouldn't do that. They closed ranks and they refused to hand over the people who raped and murdered this woman. And so what do the other tribes do? They said, well, they cannot get away with it. And so they went to war. And as a result of that, almost the whole tribe of Benjamin was wiped out. There was only 600 men alive afterwards. So they realized we can't do it like this. Yeah, we cannot go around upholding the law and upholding justice in this kind of way. It's not going to work. It just leads to civil war. And sometimes it leads to feuding. Yeah. If there's no police around and somebody steals something from you, what do? You just allow them to steal all your things? Or you think, okay, I'm going to go and get my own back. I'm going to go and teach that person a lesson. He did something, he stole something from me. I'm going to go and beat him up so he never does it again. How does that work? Okay, he killed my son. There's no police around, there's no justice. In order to have justice, I have to go and kill his son or his cousin or something. And that's how you get feuds between families. That's how the mafia works. You get all these feuds going on because there's no independent source of justice and anybody independent person who will uphold the law and apply the law and punish the criminals. That's one problem. Yeah. How do you deal with people who break the law? Do you go to feuding? What does the mafia do? Getting revenge? Does that solve the problem? It just leads to a breakdown of peace and social disorder, and it creates hell. The other problem is invading by neighboring tribes. The other problem that the Israelites face, from time to time, they're invaded by the neighbors, the Philistines, the Midianites, and different people They were invaded, they were attacked, and because they didn't have a king, they didn't have a government, then they had to mobilize an army, yeah, on a voluntary principle. And it was really difficult to do that. So how do you protect your country or your tribe or your neighborhood or your village from some other group, a gang who comes along and wants to come along and nick your stuff? And so that's why you need government. This is David Hume. It's probable the first time one man came to rule over multitudes. We talk about one man here. We're talking about somebody who ends up becoming a king, yeah, or a ruler in some sense. The first time that happens, he says, began during a state of war. So if we look at what happened in the time of the Israelites, David Hume read the Bible. He wasn't a religious person. He read it as a fascinating work of history and political philosophy. It's incredibly profound. It describes everything. They're getting attacked by the Philistines. So the people went to Samuel and said, we need to have a king who can lead the army. And so Samuel anointed Saul. Saul became the king. He was the one who mobilized an army. Soldiers from all the 12 tribes of Israel were mobilized, and he set up an army. And he was a great warrior and general and king. So that's how it starts. Because of war, you need a king. You need a leader to mobilize an army. That's why kings, the most important role of a king is always to be a warrior, head of the armed forces. They're supposed to, because that was their job originally. It's how they came to be. But superiority of courage, you need a courageous king, warrior, and genius. In other words, you need to have a good strategy to lead the army, to come up with a good plan to defeat the other army and to defend the city or whatever, discovers itself most visibly. So in that kind of crisis situation, somebody appears who is A, incredibly courageous and brave, and B, has got good ideas and a good plan, so he's able to convince people this is a good plan, this is the way we can do it. So those kind of leaders emerge in that situation, where unanimity and cooperation are important. It's really important to have a good leader, everyone recognizes he's a good leader, and they cooperate with that person to form an army, where they work together to defend the country. And where the bad effects of disorder are most keenly felt. So if there's no discipline within the army, you lose the war, you lose the battle. Yeah, 1066. The long continuance of that state, an incident common among savage tribes, is very common for tribes and people to be in a state of war, which means they always need to have a leader, someone in that position, made people submissive. So it just became natural for people just to do as they were told, to do what the king told them to do. They got used to it. They got used to just following orders from the king, who was a warrior. And if the chieftain, this warrior, possessed as much justice as prudence and courage, in other words, if he was recognized not just to be a great warrior, but also people realized actually he's quite a decent person as well. He's quite a fair person. He doesn't discriminate people. He doesn't exhibit favoritism. Actually, he's a just person. He became, even during the peace, the arbiter of all differences. So we saw that also during the time of the judges. There was someone called Gideon. He led the army, defeated the Midianites. Then after they defeated the Midianites, the people came to him and said, would you be the king over us to judge things? Yeah, even in peace, we want you to be our king. And could gradually be a mixture of force and consent establishes authority. So sometimes the authority starts off with force, but if this person is actually a wise person, regarded as a good leader, is able to judge fairly, uphold the law, people actually consent. Yes, we need someone in this position to solve our problems. We need somebody in this position to independently uphold justice and punish the criminals, as opposed to having a feud in a civil war. The benefit felt from his influence made it be cherished by the people, at least the peaceable and well-disposed among them. So then people realize when we have a king, he defends the country from being invaded. He also upholds the law and punishes the rapists, the murderers, and the criminals. So I can sleep easily in my bed because I know that nobody's going to break into my home and steal all my things, rape me, my wife, or murder me. Yeah, so you have stability. It's really important to have stability where you don't have a failed state. People can feel stable, they can feel safe, they can go about their business not worrying about someone doing bad things to them because they know the king is going to defend them. And so that's why good people then, they realize actually that's good. But there are lots of criminals, though, who don't like the king because the king punishes the criminals, gets them arrested, puts them in prison. So there's a good, decent people, basically they like to have a king who behaves like that. So just to finish here, what are the two functions of the government then? What's the purpose of government? We'll flesh this out more on Thursday and Friday. The first function of government then is defense. Most important function a government, most important thing a government has to do is to defend the country from being invaded, which would break the peace, damage a people's way of life, prevent them from being happy. Yeah, so when some other country invades your country, you lose everything. When the Normans under William the Conqueror, when they conquered England, England lost everything. All the land was confiscated by the king, by William the Conqueror. Every piece of land was confiscated and was reallocated to all his supporters and followers, the Normans. That's what happens. England never recovered from that till today, I'm telling you. It damages people's way of life and prevents them from being happy. So the most important function of government then is to make sure they've got a good army, not to attack other countries, nothing to do with that. It's all about defending the nation, defending the country, whether it's an army or an air force or a navy. It should be orientated towards defense. Because if you can't defend the country, then people's lives are ruined. Second most important function of government is justice. That's to maintain the laws necessary to create a realm of freedom so people can live a peaceful, moral, and meaningful life and thus be happy and fulfilled. So create this space of freedom created by law where people are free to pursue beauty, truth, and goodness. People are free to pursue and realize the three great blessings. People are free to worship God the way they want to worship God, free to say what they want to say, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of literature, publishing, and all these freedoms. People are free to manage their family, to manage their society, to set up businesses, to set up their own clubs and societies, etc. Realize the three blessings and freedom to be able to own their property, not worrying about someone stealing it. So those are the two main functions of government. People think the main function of government is health and education. That comes way down the list, way down the list. Two most important functions are defense and justice. Okay, and if a government can't do that, it doesn't deserve to call itself a government, really. And this is a really serious situation in Europe today. Hardly any European countries are capable of defending themselves from their next door neighbor, which is getting more and more aggressive all the time, called Russia. And the other next door neighbor on the other side of the world called China. If you can't defend your country, then you're going to get taken over by a predator country, because they're predatory countries who want to take over other countries. It's been like that through the whole of human history. There's no reason to think human nature will ever change. So one needs to realize this is the way it is. Adam Smith, David Hume, they described this is the way human beings are. Therefore, this is what governments need to do. Need to, first of all, defend the country and uphold justice. Yeah. And these people in America, the BLM, the Black Lives Matter movement, who talk about let's defund the police. What are they talking about? If there were no police, what would the criminals do? Who would be happy with no police force? All the criminals, all the criminal gangs would be happy because they could criminalize everybody. They could take over neighborhoods. They could intimidate people. They'd be running protection rackets. So everybody who owned a shop would have to pay a certain amount of money to this protection racket. If they didn't pay money to the protection racket, their shop would be burnt down. That's the way it works in many places. They're called failed states because there isn't a state upholding justice because there's no independent, proper police force. Yeah.